that are helping too. I think that we've all been hearing over the last 2 days the obvious failures of the positivistic and patriarchal system that we're all living in. But there have been these moments, these hopeful interventions, intersections between settler and Indigenous cultures, I think. One around the concern for the environment. One around exploring essential feminism, which when I was growing up was not to be done, but maybe there's a little bit of space there now. About maybe re-enchanting our lives again, and about dreams and creativity. We've heard all of these things the last few days. And I think especially to do with art making, which is a very different language than text and is able to communicate really profound ideas. So this session is titled Land-Based Knowledge and Creative Intervention. And sitting here, we have artists and cultural workers. Some people do both, and a guest. And there are different practices I know around land-based knowledge, both as sort of political and culturally grounding. This panel moves into art that is connected with the land. Sometimes, as in Casey Adams' case, it literally means touching the land through harvesting the fantastic foamy clay that we have here in Lake Winnipeg that I've been learning about. And sometimes it reflects a digital reworking of older traditions and forms. So I'm really thrilled to introduce our panelists, and this is in the order that they'll be speaking. So right beside me here is Heather Campbell, who's originally from Northern Labrador. She's worked as a curator at the Inuit Art Center at Indian and Northern Affairs. She's been very active in artist-run centers in Ottawa. She has a BFA from Memorial University in Newfoundland, and she's currently enjoying being an artist and a full-time mom, as you can see. And her daughter is joining us today, and maybe will even dance later for us. This is Malia, who wanted to join the panel. So beside Malia is Carl Chittum, is the director of the Tauranga Art Gallery in New Zealand. He's worked in lots of different institutes, including the University of Waikato. And he's going to talk today about public art. Down a little further, we have Michelle Lavallee, who was at the Mackenzie Gallery in Regina for 10 years. And this is where she researched and curated lots of shows, and one that we've mentioned a few times today, one that I saw in Winnipeg, Professional Native Indian Artists, Inc., with this incredible catalog. And I have to say that I think everyone loved it, but it was a big deal for the art historians here, because we didn't know this history and we were here, so it was very, very exciting for us. Michelle has a new job now. She's director of the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Art Center, which I've heard has 4,000 Indigenous artworks dating back to the 1960s. And I'm hoping that we'll get to see that body of work as she settles into that position. Casey Adams is a Winnipegger, and her art, I think, has really shaken up the city. She trained at Concordia with a BFA. She's been very, very successful with funding bodies. I was going to talk about the prestigious Winnipeg Arts Council making a MARC award, but she told me today she's just come back from Ottawa, where she got the Senator 150 award, which is also about contributing to the community. I know some of you have seen her art that's on display at the University of Winnipeg right now, her ceramic pieces with a really super smart, intelligent exhibition curated by Jenny Western entitled Shards. And her series, Perception, was installed on bus shelters all around Winnipeg, and that had a real impact on the city. And I think that it embodies what Julie Nagam calls creative intervention, which is the subtitle for this panel, and I think is one of the pillars of Indigenous art and curating, and it embodies visual sovereignty and activism, and that's really what we've been talking about for the last few days. So with that, I'll pass it on. Do you want to stand or sit? Okay.
I really wish she was old enough to do this talk for me, but she's just going to be my marketing and promotions person for now. So my name is Heather Campbell, and I'm a Nunatsiavut Inuit artist. So I'm from Northern Labrador, and I'm a mom to Malia. Couldn't forget that part. Yeah. But I've been living in Ottawa for 20 years now. Oh, I have to figure out how to use this thing. Let's see. So this is where I'm from. It's Rigolette. It's a population of, I think it's a little over 300 now. It's a fly-in community in northern Labrador. And we're basically right on the tree line. So I thought, this is about land-based knowledge, then I should at least show you the land and the people that gave me the knowledge that inspires my work. So here's another shot. This is one that my mother took this summer. Okay, remember what we said? You have to settle down, okay. So just some family photos. This is my grandmother. I was raised by my grandparents. My grandmother went to residential school, and I like telling a story about her that, is this kind of, that's okay? When she was in residential school, they were getting a bit of a hard time from the teachers, but telling them that they weren't very smart, that they didn't expect them to pass this particular test that they were going to give them. And she got all of her friends together and she said, you know what, we're going to prove them wrong. We're going to pass this test together. And that's what she did. They studied every night until the test came up. And when they actually did their tests, all of them passed with flying colors. So she ended up becoming a teacher. She married my grandfather. My grandfather actually didn't go to residential school. He's Inuit and Scottish mix. But he lived a traditional life, hunting and fishing and trapping. These are my parents. It's on their wedding day, my cousin. And I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but Labrador has a very long history of Europeans came over in the 1700s, first the German Moravian missionaries, then later the Hudson's Bay Company for fur trade. Excuse me. So my grandfather and my mom and my aunt. Oops. So in our little matchbox house, you can see kind of the quality of the insulation that we have there. That's all frost on the windows. Uh-oh, what are we doing here? Oh, so my grandfather with his fur. But I find in our family, it was my grandmother that kind of passed on a lot of the family knowledge, the family history, and it was my grandfather that actually told me a lot about the land itself and the plants and the animals and all of the different types of plants that could be used for medicine or that you could actually eat. So we do a lot of seal hunting in the spring. Yeah.
I saw Aunt Kimmy.
Oh yeah, she's in the pictures. Yeah. So that was my. Okay. You have to settle down then. So. Part of the reason why I'm showing you these pictures as well is because it ties into the piece that I have upstairs. So I wanted to show it's not just land that we're very connected to, it's also water. So we do a lot of seal hunting, especially in the spring. So more family pictures. And we were talking about generations, and I remembered that we had this photograph from my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. So it's my grandfather with his aunt, my mom, my sister, and her daughter. So when you think about the grand scheme of things, 7 generations isn't actually a lot. So some summer shots as well. So when I was growing up, my grandfather was actually a salmon fisherman. So we had a commercial fishery at that time, but because of conservation issues, we can only do subsistence fishing now. So this is where I spent my summers. Because my grandmother was a teacher and my grandfather was living traditionally, we were able to spend the whole summer here. They're irises, Arctic irises. So you'll actually see there's a lot of plants in my work as well. That's my grandmother again, a photograph that I did when I was in art school. And again, the importance of food, traditional food in our region. So this is sort of getting into my actual artwork now. So this is a piece that I did about the Voisey's Bay nickel mine in northern Labrador. And I used to be on the board of Gallery 101 in Ottawa, and we'd have a fundraiser each year. So it was based on the 7 deadly sins, so we'd have to do a piece that was part of that theme. I forget what the theme was for this one, but I'm not sure if anyone recognizes it. They're based on historical paintings, but I've Inuitize them. So this is, can anyone take a guess as to who the head is? Harper, yeah. This one was on the cover of the Inuit Art Quarterly, and it's about the early breakup of spring ice and how climate change is affecting our seasons, our traditional activities, our traditional transportation systems. I recently illustrated an article for the New York Times about my community. So I don't know if any of you saw it. I think it was last Saturday. And it was along the lines of this image here. And then this idea of flora. But I think the reason why I'm here is actually because of this piece. It was Heather Igloliorti had told Jason Lewis about my work and was asked to make a piece related to 7 generations. So this is how I envisioned an Inuit community to look like 7 generations from now. So it starts off sort of bleak because it's about climate change and how the ocean levels are rising to the point where we have to move our communities up into the hills, but at the same time, we've embraced sort of solar power, wind power, and kind of the fun idea of how are we going to take the traditional knowledge that we have now, or elements of traditional culture, and modernize them, not just now, but generations from now. So that's why I have this shape of the igloo. So I'm thinking, why are we putting sort of Western ideals of architecture as something that we have to aspire to? Maybe it's time that we look at our own inventions. I mean, it's one of the most ingenious inventions ever, is the igloo. So I wanted to use that because it's one of the strongest forms. Oops, sorry. And on the roof, we've put solar panels, so it would withstand the extreme weather conditions that would probably be on our planet at that time. Yes, Leah.
I saw that painting.
Yeah, so it was recently in the Sakiayuk exhibition in St. John's, Newfoundland. And is it coming here next summer?
Yeah, it's coming here this summer.
This coming summer.
So we're staying here another.
Yeah.
I think it's soon. April, there you go.
So it's been purchased by the rooms in St. John's, but it'll keep touring until the show is over. So, and the last image that we have here is the one that we actually see upstairs. Malia isn't a fan of it, and I can understand why. So I'm not sure if many of you make the connection between the piece and the title, but in my region right now, they're creating a huge hydroelectric dam at Mud Lake. And part of the problem that we have with this project is that an independent Harvard study has said that if they flood the land without clearing the vegetation and the topsoil, when they do flood it, it will create, like the rotting of the vegetation will create methylmercury. So it's a neurotoxin. It can also cause cancer. It causes like birth defects and this sort of thing. So, yes, Leah. You have to wait, okay? Just 2 more minutes. So last year, there were a lot of protests in our community in that area, in Rigolet as well as Goose Bay, Mud Lake area. And it was trying to keep them from flooding the area before removing all of this vegetation. So in the image itself, you can see that at the top, we have all of this kind of ugly, dark imagery. We've got what looks sort of like evil spirits. And that represents the methylmercury, but also represents sort of, corporate greed and government attitudes, I guess, towards indigenous land rights and I mean, they're basically ignoring what we're trying to tell them. This is going to affect us. This is going to affect the water that we depend on. As you saw, it's a very deep connection that we have with the ocean. We fish in the summer. We have seals in the spring. We fish in the winter as well. So the central figure is actually based on the Inuit sea goddess Nuliayuk. So sometimes she's pictured usually half woman and half some other creature. But here she's a beluga. Swimming around her are all of the creatures that came from her fingers. But the poison that's infiltrating the ocean and contaminating the ocean is personified as around her throat. And then we have the phallic poison going into her mouth and down into her system. So it's also making that connection. I mean, I think most of us that are Indigenous at least have every day we're seeing things on our Facebook feed about violence against Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's always in the back of my mind. And I wanted to make that connection as women or the goddess as a symbol of that systemic violence and disregard for women. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say for now. But I see it as a jumping off point. If you guys want to talk to me later, come say hi and talk to me one-on-one because I'm much more comfortable that way. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather. Carl Chittum is up next.
Okay. Ngā mihi kia koutou. My name's Carl Chittum. I'm the director of Tauranga Art Gallery, which has Serena Cedars in New Zealand. It's a sort of coastal seaside village that's now become a bit of a urban sprawl. So today I'm sort of recontextualising Kiriama Taipa's practice, who you were introduced to yesterday, and looking at the role of public art in the relationships we have with places and spaces, and our kind of understanding of the way that we interact with not only urban environments but also the natural landscape. And the other thing that I'm using, I've got competition. It's a lot of competition today, yeah. The other thing I'm using Kiriama's work for is to kind of illustrate the way that public art can, particularly Indigenous public art, can infiltrate or upset the norm. So kind of creating a disruption, I guess. Just like that. There's a few disruptions going on. I'm all good with that. So just to provide a little bit of context as well. So Kiriama and I both live in Tauranga Moana, which is the Māori name for Tauranga. And as I said, it's on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. It has huge urban growth over a very short period of time, probably in the last 5 or 6 years. It's nearly doubled in land area. And prior to that, it was a very sleepy seaside retirement village, and the average age was 50. So things have changed quite dramatically, and a lot of the people that are moving there are from major urban centres because they can't afford to live in those places anymore. So as you can imagine, there's been a lot of changes, not just to the way that we live in that place, and I'm one of those imports as well. I've only been there for 2 years. But it's also about the way that the land is being used. Now I'm losing my place. It's all those disruptions. So the other important thing to talk about with tauranga, and the reason that I'm talking about tauranga is that it's a really good example of what's happening in New Zealand in terms of the change in the way that we use those landscapes and the way that cities are changing as well. We don't build up, we build flat and out. And we don't have the huge, vast spaces that you have here. It's a very restricted environment with a very small population that's growing very quickly. So the other thing that's interesting about Tauranga is that it's been a place of significant Māori settlement for many hundreds of years. The area that Tauranga is in is called the Bay of Plenty, as coined by Captain Cook when he came through, and that was because he saw so many Māori settlements in that place. But it's also been a really contested space because of those the plentiful resources there. So it's now become a contested space again, and it's interesting to run an art gallery in that place, and probably for Kiriyama to be an artist working in that space as well. So one of the other things that's happening in Tauranga at the moment is Kiriyama and I both attended a panel discussion as part of the local Architecture Week. And one of the speakers was a representative of a local iwi or hapu group, Māori tribal group, who are using development in what they see as a very positive way, where they're working with developers to build their own community housing schemes, which are a mixture of private and commercial. And while there's huge positives for Māori communities in doing this, for someone from the outside looking in, it feels like there's also a lot of negatives, because the land they're building on is Māori land, so it's specifically owned by Māori, and that land is often the only green space left. So as soon as they develop that green space, you lose that natural landscape. So while they're trying to create environments that are positive for their communities and their whānau and their kind of greater group, there's some negatives that come with that as well. Anyway, I'm rabbiting on about that. So I'm going to talk about Kiriyama's work from a slightly different angle from what Kiriyama was talking about yesterday, which was a lot of the digital technology. Kiriyama's practice actually has developed into quite a successful public art practice as well, and he's had a number of large commissions. And yesterday he mentioned, I'm assuming I just do that. Oh yeah. So yesterday he mentioned a really important work, and I'm assuming that this is the work. So it's called A Very Brief History of Aotearoa. It's part of what's called the Four Plinths Project, or Sculpture Commission. The building behind it is Te Papa, which is our national museum. Megan Tamati-Quinell, who spoke earlier, works there. And this is quite a significant commission for any New Zealand artist. So it's been really exciting to see Kiriyama's work here. So the work is, it's a gateway. Hundreds of thousands of people come through this space every year. So the number of people that have access to this particular story and this particular history that Kiriyama is talking about is immense. And I guess it kind of reflects what he was talking about yesterday, which is a shared history or a shared experience that I have, which is being urban Māori, being white-looking. You kind of grow up with a very different understanding of what it is to be Indigenous or what it is to be Māori. And you have to kind of reassert yourself back into your own history, but you have to know what that history is first. And so I had a very similar experience to Kiriyama in terms of I didn't learn about much of my culture until I was at university. So this work here, A Very Brief History of Aotearoa, kind of charts that history of Māori occupation, but in a really challenging way. So I'm just going to read you a couple of excerpts that I wrote for an essay about the work, which kind of explains the individual pieces. So they're read from left to right on the screen, and I'll just talk about each one. So Taipa begins his account with a stylised depiction of a wharenui or Māori meeting house. Its outline, with gable peak and negative spaces to suggest a door and a window, reference an architectural form that should be familiar to most New Zealanders, but often isn't. Positioned as the starting point in Taipa's abbreviated timeline, the simple whare motif emphatically states that the first phase of the history of Aotearoa should be with Māori. And just a little interjection there, often our history is told from the first point of contact. And then after that it's told from the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which was in 1840. So in a lot of history books, it doesn't start till 1840. So this was a time before European explorers, whalers and colonists appeared in the story. Although this symbol is a placeholder for pre-European occupation, it also acts as an avatar of sorts, representing the ongoing topics of importance for Māori moving forward. The remaining three icons have at different times been associated with the way in which Māori have been marginalised, mistreated and manipulated throughout the process of and as a result of colonisation. The mitre, a traditional headwear of bishops from a number of Christian faiths and in particular a symbol of the Pope, the senior representative of the Roman Catholic Church, holds a lot of power for Taipa. He talks about how many of the early missionaries became focused on educating and controlling Māori communities by converting their senior members to Christianity, much like Johnson's game yesterday. This had a significant impact on both the loss of many customary practices, but also on the sense of authority and agency Māori held over their own fate. A number of these European men of God also became leaders among the first colonial settlements and at times represented the British government and monarchy in their dealings with local issues. Taipa includes the crown as a symbol to represent this period, and in particular the monarchy's participation in the signing of and ongoing responsibilities to Te Tiriti or Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi. The final symbol in the lineup, and the one positioned closest to its namesake, is the beehive, the executive wing of the parliamentary buildings of New Zealand. This iconic edifice, completed in the late 1970s, has come to symbolise our government, and for many it also represents the injustices Māori has suffered in the years since the treaty was signed. Taipa understands this as a complicated relationship with multiple perspectives. He talks about his version of the beehive as a marker, a reference to the ongoing social, cultural and political issues that still exist for Māori today. And so you will see from each of those symbols that they've been pixelated. They're sort of like a computer rendering. And at the base of each of those, I'm going to go back, sorry. At the base of each of those plinths is a QR code. And if you use an app, you can play a game of Spaceys. But the Space Invaders game that you're playing is not in space, it's actually in Aotearoa, and you represent Māori, or the whare, at the bottom, and you are battling the invading forces. So you can destroy the church, you can destroy the monarchy, and you can destroy the government. And to be honest, we've just had a change of government, which is really exciting for us. And it was really satisfying when the previous government were in to be playing that game. So this is an opportunity for not only tech-savvy teenagers to kind of engage with the work, but it's an intergenerational approach where not only people from our generation who understand the species reference, but also younger generations and the older generation who have kind of gone through a lot of the kind of angst that's come about because of treaty negotiations and also everything else. Many people today and yesterday have spoken of kind of this grief and trauma, and that's still very present in New Zealand as well. Okay, I'm moving on real fast. So this work's called Tiki, T-I-C-H-I, and it was a commission for the city centre of New Plymouth, which is also, as a region, has had a really traumatic experience for local Māori with colonial interactions. And so the tiki form is a reduced form, so there's no eyes, there's no mouth. You saw some of Kiriama's work yesterday, which is really heavily detailed. This one's been stripped back to a really basic form. It's 2.5 metres high and cast in bronze, and I guess the thing about this work, which has been really interesting for me as the self-appointed president of the Kiriama Taipa fan club, has been to, you can join later if you want, is that I've been able to follow his work, not only the good stuff, but also the bad stuff. So this was a controversial work. Not the work, I don't mean the work. But it's been this work has been really contentious in that community, and not just because of the artistic merit of the work, or not even because of the artistic merit of the work, but also because Kiriama's Māori, and he's not from that place necessarily, or that was the interpretation by local Pākehā residents. And I think that kind of raises a lot of questions about the place of public art and how it's interpreted by those people that live in those places. And I think the important thing with this is that it's become a catalyst for discussion about the role that public art plays, and particularly public art by Māori or Indigenous artists. Okay, and that's just a street shot of it. Okay, and now we're moving on. So Kiriama and I first met in, well, we didn't first meet there, but we spent the most time together in Rotorua when I was the curator of the museum there. And I was on a number of public art panels at the time, and this was one of the commissions that came through, which was the local council wanting to reduce the amount of waste being produced in the community, so they wanted to put in drinking fountains. And they wanted to commission a local artist to create these appealing fountains so that particularly young people would engage with them. And you can see from this image that Kiriama's kind of taken that wholeheartedly on board. But the thing that I got really excited about when we saw this proposal versus the other proposals we saw, and there were a lot of really good ones, was that it made you think of the purpose of waste reduction. And so there's all this imagery there of, you know, kids playing, skateboarders, there's kind of that graffiti splodgy thing going on. But there's also the natural environment in there. So it's kind of putting all those elements together was the thing that got us over the line with this particular thing, this particular commission. Not to mention it just looks cool. So of course people will use it. So this was kind of, although this came after the next work I'm going to talk about, it kind of cements the relationship that Kiriama's practice has with conservation and the environment, but it also kind of brings those public works and private works together as well, because you can see a lot of similarities with his other practice. Now, the next work, which is, we're going to play it, yep. It does have a soundtrack, but I'll talk over it. you're going to see a little bit of this. This was a project that was for the Redwoods, which is a local, in Rotorua, it's a major kind of public reserve. Obviously redwoods aren't native to New Zealand, but what the commission was for was to decorate or create the outside of the toilet blocks, the public toilet blocks. So this kind of animation that's going is actually Kiriyama's development of the shrouds that would go around this work. And I think you can see the relationship to the fountains that were previously there. So the point of this work was to kind of look at environmentalism and to think about how we can kind of utilise our natural spaces, but ironically they're on the outside of toilets, which are the things that we try and hide. So there were some quite interesting things going on there. And I just found this little statistic. It's estimated that since human habitation, over 46% of endemic bird species have become extinct in New Zealand. And 15 species have become extinct since 1840. And we don't have a lot of species. So that's a huge number. And to have works like this communicate to those issues has been really significant in New Zealand. So I'm just going to leave you with one last thought. When I was talking about Kiriyama about how to respond to the premise of the symposium, we were going to do something else where he was going to be in New Zealand and he was going to Skype in live and we were going to be all future, past, present. But he's here, so we didn't do that. So when we were talking about the premise of the symposium, 7 generations into the future, I was reflecting on how for Māori, the past and the present are interchangeable terms. They exist simultaneously and therefore become part of our everyday. We acknowledge our ancestors because they're always present. But I noted we rarely talked about the future as a space for potentialities. It is a certainty, but we never talk about the ways to fill that space. But what Kiriyama pointed out was that the way we refer to the future is in terms of kaitiakitanga, or safekeeping, or guardianship. We talk about looking after our knowledge, traditions, and natural environment, not for ourselves, but for the generations to come. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Carl. Michelle? You going to sit? Okay.
Oh, you can turn that back down. Seriously. Not in show business. Well, not yet. So hopefully there's a PowerPoint that'll just rotate behind me, and it's just some images that the Art Center staff had available. So, Ani Bojo, Tansei, Sago, bonjour, good afternoon, Ki Waitenkwe and Indishnakas. I want to acknowledge the original and ongoing custodians of this area, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, that we are in Treaty 1 territory, also homeland of the Métis Nation. And I want to give thanks to you all for being here, Elder Mary Cochin for the words this morning, Joseph and Cheryl for the ceremony and the song yesterday, and the many other songs shared. And to say that it's always a humbling experience and a privilege to be here alongside colleagues whom I have and continue to learn from and have great respect for. I also want to thank the organizers, Julie, Jamie, Scavanati, Jason, and the many, many other folks that I know are involved in these events for inviting me to participate today as part of the 3rd IIF Symposium, and to the Winnipeg Art Gallery for providing space to contemplate the continuum between our histories, our present, and our imaginings for the future. As some of you will be aware, I've only very recently, like a few weeks ago, I've accepted a new position as Director of the Indigenous Arts Centre at Indian and Northern Affairs Canada in Gatineau. And in thinking about the future, I wanted to take this opportunity to briefly refamiliarize folks with the Art Center and the Indigenous Art Collection, and solicit and put out some very initial thoughts about future potentials. In consideration of this panel, this past week, I've started to think about my stepping away from curating and taking a position in federal government at INAC in the context of creative intervention. INAC isn't an Indigenous institution. It's not my space. I have to occupy it, as those before me have. As a curator, artist, Anishinaabe, perhaps this is what makes it creative intervention. And I'm also thinking about the Indigenous Art Collection, with all its history, as creative intervention into the future, or rather the continuous now. 4,246 artworks, 838 artists, over 73 years of contemporary Indigenous art and counting. The Indigenous Art Collection is a living continuum between our histories, our present, and the next 7 generations and beyond. So if I may, for those who may not be familiar with the Art Center and the collection, particularly those, our friends from abroad, and because the feedback I've received is that the collection really is underutilized because more people need to know about it, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is. Designated a federal heritage collection, the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, or INAC Indigenous Art Collection, is held in trust for future generations. The collection is intended for the promotion, preservation of contemporary Indigenous culture in this place now called Canada. The department has been acquiring and collecting works since the 1960s, and the Indigenous Art Collection now includes over 4,200 works by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis artists. Paintings and prints make up roughly 40% of the collection, the balance being sculpture, fiber arts, beadwork, carvings, ceramics, drawings, installation art, photography, and textiles. With over 800 Indigenous artists represented in the collection, it really does represent a living visual history of Canada's Indigenous art of the past 50 years. Now, the Indigenous Art Centre is a program within Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. Its mandate is to develop, care for, and promote the Indigenous Art Collection, both within the department and externally, through national and international arts communities. Responsible for the caretaking and management of the collection, the center's services include an acquisition program, an art lending program, a resource library, and an INAC art gallery. The Art Center has always had a mandate to support contemporary living artists at every stage of their career. Very significant is the history of its Indigenous-led collecting practices and management. The collection was developed in consultation with Indigenous artists and arts and cultural communities. More than other institutions with Indigenous art collections, INAC has always integrated Indigenous people as employees managing the collection, as essential participants in the collection development process, and following the community's guidance on artist needs and future directions. The Art Center loans work for display and exhibition internally and externally. Artworks are installed in INAC offices both at headquarters and in the regions, as well as in exhibitions at the INAC Art Gallery at 10 Wellington, creating a visual awareness of Indigenous people, our art, our history, and current issues in the INAC workplace, but also beyond. Given the significance of the collection, the center also regularly receives loan requests from international, national, and regional art institutions for exhibition and publication purposes. The commitment to ensure this cultural heritage is accessible is balanced with the risk management responsibilities through the implementation of various measures and best practices for the safeguarding and ensuring the protection of this irreplaceable collection. Over many years, the Art Center has developed strong partnerships with other organizations, art collecting institutions, and galleries in Ottawa and across the country. These have included, and hopefully will continue to include, the National Gallery, the National Arts Centre, the National Capital Commission, as well as the Canada Council, and many others. The development of partnerships involving the loan of select works from the collection for special exhibitions is a key objective of the Art Centre, as they've resulted in exposure and financial benefits to the artists, and at the heart of these public-facing projects is Indigenous curatorship and engagement. A current strategic desire is to further strengthen the collection's external profile at the local, national, and international levels through exhibitions at various institutions and through many more partnerships. The goal is to achieve a more appropriate balance to align more closely with the mandate and responsibilities of the Art Centre, cognizant that the Centre's capacity to build on existing momentum has at times been compromised with competing pressures to prioritize and fulfill internal loans. To my knowledge, however, the department has never been given authorship in regards to the presentation, as much as they sometimes want it. The presentation of the collection has always come from the creative authorship of the Indigenous community, and not just in the form of consultation, but lies within an Indigenous-led framework with Indigenous stakeholders working with the Art Centre. Here, I'm also going to mention we're currently in the midst of producing a large publication that will highlight works from the collection, also selected through a peer-juried process led by Leanne Martin, alongside her esteemed colleagues, Sheriff Rosette, Simon Brascape, David General, Vivian Gray, Dr. Heather Gloriarty, Gerald McMaster, Arthur Renwick, Ryan Rice, and Dr. Carmen Robertson, and with book design by Sebastian Aubin, who we heard from yesterday. As the first monograph of hopefully many more to come, to highlight the collection's national importance and historical value as one of the largest, most comprehensive collections of contemporary Indigenous art, former director Vivian Gray's essay details the history of this study and lending collection that, together with the publication, will continue to be a significant public resource for contemporary Indigenous art. And the Centre is always looking for curators, artists, and scholars to research and work with and engage with the collection creatively. So get in touch with me, please. There is an extensive resource library of material related to the collection and Indigenous art history that is frequently used by researchers, educators, students, curators, and artists. And it holds a lot of those early publications, articles, and materials which can't be found online and in some cases anywhere else. I know it has proven a critical resource for many, and I've utilized it myself previously for the 7 Professional Native Indian Artists Inc. exhibition, among several other projects. And I've heard testimony from other curators to its significance as well, most recently from a young curator, Daniel Printup, regarding the importance of the collection and the Resource Center for her. For her, it's integral that the research was coming from the Indigenous artists themselves. She says, I wasn't reading and referencing textbooks written by non-Indigenous people, which was basically my entire university experience. But instead, I was reading exhibition essays and catalogs from Indigenous curators, interviews, artist statements, letters between artists and Art Centre staff, all these rich materials where Indigenous voice took precedence. So this speaks to one of the reasons the collection and Resource Center is so unique. It's simply how it was built and by whom. It really is structured in a way that emerging curators can learn from the Indigenous arts community and then in turn bring back new ideas and insight. And I look forward to working with many of you in the future. So as Canada's oldest and only federal heritage collection devoted to Indigenous contemporary art, the collection is unique in that it spans the entire Canadian Indigenous contemporary art movement. The heritage significance of its holdings, individually and collectively, is meaningful for past, present, and future generations and really can't be underestimated. It is one of the most important and comprehensive public art collections of contemporary Indigenous art in Canada. But how did this amazing collection end up at INAC? Its existence a little bit. Its existence resulted from a long-standing desire or debate to have our art stewarded in a place outside of mainstream institutions. Is there irony in it being at INAC? Of course, but while Indigenous government relations have always been dysfunctional, the needs of Indigenous artists were not being addressed at all by galleries and museums. So where this sits now, that's a bigger discussion. But while I don't know what the future of the INAC Indigenous Arts Center and Collection will be exactly, INAC, via the Art Center, continues to play an important role as caretaker of a most important living art collection. What we do know is that existing outside of a particular mainstream institution, the collection has continually developed in a collaborative, Indigenous-led way, not from a single curatorial or director's vision. This one-of-a-kind legacy collection has concentrated on supporting Indigenous artists and curators with a mandate to continue into the future. Placed within one of the oldest bureaucracies in federal government, now split in two, doesn't mean that there isn't always some consternation. But positioned within this bureaucratic frame, the Art Center program is a creative intervention. As mentioned, it is the result of Indigenous-led priorities and the occupation and creation of space within a system to ensure a legacy. To be a constant reminder of the presence and realities of Indigenous peoples, our resilience, and the way Indigenous people in this land, now called Canada, are embedded in and integral to history as economically, politically, and culturally fundamental to how this country has developed. This collaboratively built collection facilitates institutional subversion, and as Indigenous folks, including artists and curators, authorize, engage, and serve Indigenous perspectives that have informed progressive and responsive curation, and the development of this most important collection that has continuously operated in in-between space, within INAC, yet often always positioned to also address issues not yet settled by INAC. The collection is a coalescence of stories and traditions, claimed or reclaimed on artists' own terms, in order to put forth honest answers and propositions about our histories, our realities, our futures. But I'm thinking about the Indigenous art collection not so much as a historical archive, but a question of the future itself, an expanded horizon. It is the question of a response, a promise of, and a responsibility for tomorrow. The future is Indigenous. The future of the Indigenous art collection is Indigenous-led and Indigenous stewardship. By whom, where, when, and how? Well, this is what's so exciting about entering the role at this time in our histories, and it's a lot to think about. No pressure. And probably a whole other talk. But I definitely welcome you to be a part of that conversation, and I look forward to your guidance. Chimigwich.
Thanks, Michelle. Casey?
Tansei. Usually I'm first, because my last name, right? So it's weird being last. That's awesome. Kapapama Piminat Mikasuas Koyo Nitisina, which is my name. I was gifted a couple of years ago, is Flying Overhead Eagle Woman, and I try to share that name as often as I can. I just want to acknowledge the ancestors that walked this land before me, and just want to thank all the organizers of this event and for having me. And so I was thinking about reflecting on my work as an artist, and we're sort of thinking 7 generations ahead. And the Rock Cree has a word that's miskanau, and it's the lifelong journey from birth to child to adulthood, and it's a path in which you're guided by others, and that's really important. These people help you recognize your purpose for being here, and help you to develop the gifts for feeling that purpose. And despite the fact that I was raised without my culture and growing up in a military home, I can reflect back and look at my life and realize that I have been guided by the spirits and the spirits of my ancestors my entire life, and I was just fortunate enough to intuitively know to listen to them. And you may call it intuition, others may call it being one with the universe, but Val Vint, who is here from Manitoba, she's a knowledge keeper. She said, "Oh, honey, it's not one with the universe, you're one with the spirits. The spirits have been guiding you." So I've been using that ever since she taught me that. And it's these spirits that when I'm walking out the door and I see an object, I'll always grab that object because I know that someone's going to need that object, or I'm going to need that object for teaching. It's the same spirits that took me to Montreal when I couldn't speak a word of French and I had $800 in my pocket. It's that same knowledge that took me to a moccasin making workshop where Kathy Mattis was, and Kathy Mattis is a curator, and she helped guide my beginning of my career. And she said to me, Casey, one of these days, you are going to do a piece about identity. And I told Kathy, I said, forget about it. I'm assimilated. I'm the perfect representation of what residential schools are. I'm the product of that, and I'm totally fine with that. And she kind of shook her head and said, oh no. You are going to do work about your identity. And sure enough, I did this piece that's on display right now. It's Cyborg Hybrid. And then she said to me, Casey, you're going to do work about community. And I said no. It terrified me, and I'm a twin, and I'm fiercely protective of my artwork, and it's a soul endeavor. And she said, no, you're going to do work about community. And sure enough, she was right. And I wish she was here, because she would probably be like, yes, I told her that. But the thing is that I'm bringing this up is because it is also the spirits that guided me to meet Cheryl Lirindell, who told me that I had every right to my culture even though I wasn't raised with it, who changed the course of my life. It was Skawanati, who also shared with me her knowledge and told me to write, which I still don't do, but I'm sorry, I will eventually. It was also Faye Heavyshield, Bonnie Devine, Nadia Mir, Joan Cardinal Schubert. There's just a huge list of women, Indigenous women and mothers that have entered into my life because the spirits have guided me and brought me to the right places at the right time. And I think that's really important because my Miskinau is so much clearer because of the mentorship of this community of women. So when I think about the future, I think about the role of an artist and the importance of us teaching and mentoring those who are following from behind. So I'm thinking of children, I'm talking youth, I'm talking about young artists who are coming up and starting their career and the importance of mentorship. Also, the Rocky Cree knowledge keeper, William Dumas, he also speaks about how the elders have always said that you cannot know where you're going. You need to be grounded into the present and the past. And once you are, then you know where to go. And one of the issues that I have is that the access to elders, the access to that knowledge. Apparently, I don't know the statistics on this, but cultural and language is going extinct faster than species are. So we need to hold on to that culture, and we need to hold on to that knowledge to know where we're going. So how do we do that? So as artists, we have difficulties with elders telling us that this is sacred information and that it cannot be shared through new media, through video, through photography. And the reality is that in the past, if you shared that knowledge, you were jailed. That's no longer the case. So as artists, what we need to do is we need to start convincing the elders that we need to share this knowledge and start doing projects that will allow us to pass that knowledge on. So I'm happy to say, these are some of the photos that I'm going to be working with Duncan Meckerday, who is from Grand Rapids. I went on a journey up north to meet with hydro-affected communities, and it was devastating. I had no idea what happened to a community when a dam is created, and mercury poisoning is just one of the things that happens. So So what Duncan and I just got some funding for is to create a new media piece where we combine his poetry, his knowledge that he had gotten from his grandmother, and we're going to combine this into a new media piece and also a book of poems where we're going to be putting my photos with his poetry. And we're also going to create them into these short video clips that can be shared and passed on social media. And I think these are really important. And then I'm just going to go to the show that has changed my life. But a lot of things have been changing my life, but this really has changed my life. Jenny Western invited myself and other artists to learn about Indigenous pottery. And I've been working with clay for 20 years. And this was such an amazing experience for me because we had this Grant Goltz, who is this hippie that loves Indigenous culture and took it upon himself, working with anthropologists and archaeologists, to figure out how Indigenous pottery was created from this region, from the Lake Agassiz region. And he figured it out, and then he was passing that knowledge on to us. And what happened was, through this process, like I've always said that I've been connected to nature, but going through this process and learning and foraging from the land, practicing what my ancestors practiced, brought a lot of knowledge that I had no idea. It creates a deeper connection to the land and a deeper connection to the ancestors. So I brought some of the pieces. This is the first pot that I made with Grant and fired it on my own using the same techniques as my ancestors. And the cool thing is that it takes an hour and a half to fire this thing, whereas in commercial clay it would explode. So what I learned was the technology that they utilized was far superior. It's non-stick. You need very little fire to cook your food, and it's far superior than metal. And the only reason why it was abandoned was because it was just easier to carry and store. We used to bury our pots and leave them where they were so that we could come back to them. Another thing that I learned was the roles of women and men. So if you go to the show at Shards, you'll see the different roles. Oh, sweetie. Oh, there she is. Oh, no. Oh, poor thing. Oh, I need to recognize, since this is being videotaped, I need to recognize my son, Mac. Because every time I am recorded, he says, "Mom, how come you didn't mention me?" So I'm mentioning you now, okay? And it's really important that we include them because my son goes to full moon ceremonies with us, and he's adorable because he takes care of the fire, because the men are the fire keepers and the women are the water carriers. So you see that in the installation, the roles of the men and the women, because we are the ones that collect the clay. We're the ones that build the pots, and they are the ones that fire it. And what I've been doing is passing out clay shards. So has everybody touched one yet? Have you guys gotten your clay shards yet? So these clay shards, what you're holding in your hands, or if it's passed through your hands, this is something that was created by a woman anywhere from 400 to 2,000 years ago. These are clay shards that were taken from this territory, that were collected by this friend of mine. And he said, "You know what, Casey, I want to gift this to you so that you can teach others the importance of your ancestors and that knowledge that each piece carries." I do want them back. So that I can keep passing this knowledge on to others. Sorry. But also I learned a lot about timing and the importance of knowing the landscape and knowing the land and being able to work at a certain timing, and like those are you can read a lot about how things are made, but until you actually work the land, you really don't have an understanding of it. And also, some of you, if you look at the piece really closely, you will see bits of larger stone in the piece. And Kevin Brownlee, the lead archaeologist at the Manitoba Museum, he theorizes that perhaps some of these bits were added from ceremony so that you can carry that ceremony with you at all times. Because our ancestors, they were all responsible for art. And I'm just going to wrap it up by saying that art was created by everybody in a community. It was our way of communicating with the spirits. Colonization systematically destroyed those forms of communication and banned us from creating these beautiful objects and clothing. It was a way of silencing our voices. By taking up art, and I mean everybody, I'm not just talking about the few of us who have this ability to translate a lot of information through art, but I'm talking about every single person in this space. By we taking up art, we're following the steps of our ancestors and giving our spirit back. So miigwech, ekosani.
So, Julie, this is what creative intervention looks like, I think. Do we have time for questions? Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts, comments? I know, it's a lot to think about. Shall I start with one? Okay. So, I was thinking about all the binaries that you guys have talked about. So being in and out of culture, sacred spirit versus science, modernization, traditional knowledge and digital knowledge, water and fire. I mean, these are all these binaries. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about how you negotiate these spaces that seem so different for me?
Well, I think, we all have had a very similar colonized sort of education, so it's there, right? And I often tell people that I've spent the past 20 years trying to sort of think on the other side of my education. You can never get away from it. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be there. So it's like, as an Indigenous female artist, it's important to see what the other side is. And plus, being a twin, I kind of see, like I'm always kind of balancing two sides all the time, and my work is about hybridity all the time, so I think it just comes naturally to me.
Michelle, do you work on the other side?
Are you asking if I go both ways?
I am.
Maybe. How do I negotiate the colonial institutions and bureaucracies that I've always been employed in? I'm still working on it. I don't think I've experienced it super successfully yet. I don't know if it's always a negotiation so much as a assertion and occupation. And I think there's lots of institutions who say a lot of things and, maybe are trying to move in a good way, but that can't be done without looking at, without support and without giving up some control and listening to the people you're saying and expecting, you're consulting. So I think for institutions where maybe that's not happening progressively or fast enough, I think the people in the positions need to consider maybe how they're handling consultation and how they're really trying to move things forward without opening it up and giving up some power in creating spaces to be activated in a way that's directed by the Indigenous people, like what's been happening here the last couple of years. But yeah, it's a continuous challenge, but it's also productive, and it's been quite enjoyable. You know, I've learned a lot working in these institutions from everybody I've worked with, and I imagine I will continue to, and I make lots of mistakes, and I will continue to. But, you know, I feel supported by many of the people who are here, and Indigenous and non-Indigenous, so I think it's, I'm trying to remain cautiously optimistic in the context of my current reality. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Come closer. I don't know, that's a big question. One thing that I've gotten out of many of the talks over the last 2 days has been the experience that a lot of people have been talking about not knowing their culture. Yeah. And that's a binary in itself, that you kind of represent a culture, but you're often feeling not of that culture or not linked to that culture. And I think a lot of the things that I talked about today have come out of that sort of tension. And a lot of the things I've heard, the panel this morning, talking about a lot of those experiences, particularly for women, where there's this constant kind of bashing up against walls or trying to tear things down or trying to hold on to things. But we kind of all feel that, I think, to a degree. And that's it's not just difficult within an institutional context, which is what I work in, but it's difficult kind of navigating it through life. So I think it's just a constant. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay. So we heard an educational answer, an institutional answer, a personal answer. Do you guys have any thoughts on this? Disruption by opening up space for even a different worldview, the sacred in our lives? No comments? Do we? Do we want a break? Okay. All right, well, let's just leave it there then, and yeah, we'll come back at 2:30. Okay, thanks, everyone.